We are going to call the panel down. We've got a panel that's going to talk about how we bring diverse voices, not just into politics, but into the other institutions that impact people's lives and influence how our world is perceived. And that's the media and academia, as well as your sector. So we're going to have a Q&A session with these fantastic people who each bring their own perspective to the topic. So joining us on the panel are Dr. Paul Gray, who is the Associate Professor at Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at UTS.
Yeah, I think we'll do that.
Mariam Veiszadeh. I always get it wrong, and I've known Mariam for a long time now. Veiszadeh. Where's Maz? Oh, cool. So Mariam and I first met about 6 or 7 years ago. There was an outcry because there was a couple of Muslim girls in hijab on an Australian Day billboard. Obviously, it's not about changing the date, we should. But all these people complained that there shouldn't be Muslim girls on an Australian Day billboard, and they had the billboard taken down. And Mariam and I had not met before, and we got together and decided, fuck that. And we started a crowd fund and raised $140,000 in 3 days and put a billboard up in every single city in Australia, as well as every newspaper. Sally Aurisch, Maz is the CEO of Media Diversity Australia.
Okay.
Sally Aurisch is the CEO of Blind Citizens Australia. Tu Lee is the Community Development Manager at Marrickville Legal Centre. And Karlie Stewart is the Lecturer, School of Social Work at University of Wollongong and Manager at Weave Youth and Community Services. So we're going to get the conversation started with Cathy. Cathy, can your model of community organisation and representation take these conversations further, and where should we start?
Well, yes, absolutely. And I'm really keen to hear from everybody else about how they did it. Where you start is a small group. It's never about one person. You've got to get a group together. And then the second thing is you've got to find the one thing that's going to work, which with that lovely example, change the billboard. Doing one thing and doing it well works. And I know now, I'm just going to finish with this, in my community, we now have these action groups doing amazing stuff on climate energy. We've got community action groups all over the place taking that model of coming up with a solution. Then they go and see Helen Haynes and saying, here's what we want you to do for us. And Helen says, yes, of course. So absolutely it works.
Okay, we'll go on to Mariam next. Your Media Diversity Australia's 2020 report, Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories, confirms what many people suspect. Most stories about our incredibly diverse Australian nations are told by Anglo-Celtic journalists and presenters. In fact, only 6% of our presenters, commentators and reporters are First Nations people or from a non-European background. What happens because of that? How do stories get framed? And what are the consequences of that for people who are First Nations or from diverse backgrounds and the journalists in the minority here?
Thanks, Dee. Yeah, you've set that up beautifully with the statistics, right? Because it's fairly obvious when you read out those stats that the Australian media landscape, to put it simply, is not representative of the greater diversity that we see across the Australian population. In terms of more recently, if you think about the ABS data that has come out, if you think about the outcome of the federal election, that representation simply is not there when it comes to Australian media. And Australian media and media more broadly is a loudspeaker for change. And it's kind of the shop front of society, if I can put it that way. And so representation matters. If people don't see themselves reflected, it has huge implications. The broader implications, of course, is who's telling the stories, who decides who is going to be interviewed, who decides the angle that that particular story will take, who decides what gets covered and for how long. And prime example is with the recent coverage of the Queen's passing. And it was fairly obvious that there were lots of diverse perspectives missing, and we only started seeing some of those perspectives later on, and specifically Narelda Jacobs, Ed 10, Brooke Boney, Tony, there are a few voices that were starting to come into the mix that were presenting a different perspective that was missing from the conversation early on. That's just one example. There is a multitude of other examples, and the reality is you don't know what you don't know. No one sort of deliberately decides that they're going to not present a particular point of view, or they don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to ensure that all our coverage is very xenophobic today. It just doesn't happen like that, right? I know you're thinking there might be exceptions to that, but you didn't hear it from me. The point is, of course, that those perspectives are important. It's not having diversity for diversity's sake. It's not ticking a box. It's not being tokenistic. It's about saying Australia is diverse and that all of those perspectives need to be captured within the media. And so our data also showed that every single news director across every major network at the time of that report was white male. And we know that that's not representative of broader Australia. And so in terms of the news directors, that is starting to shift. We've got 2 women in those roles now, out of 5, and one of those women is of a culturally diverse background. These decisions matter because it has broader implications, and the Who Gets to Tell Australian Stories is being replicated, due to be released in mid-November, so stay tuned for that. You'll hear it make a splash in the headlines. And our work, we're a small team, we were discussing this earlier, but the idea is that it's about having huge impact. We've onboarded every single major media company as a paying member of Media Diversity Australia. So we have ABC, SBS, 7, 9, 10, AAP, the Daily Oz, and that list is growing, and we're in conversation with News Corp to join us as members. And the idea with the membership is to assist them with the talent, because how many times have we heard, we want to do better, but people aren't applying for the roles. So we've launched a service that kind of helps resolve that. We've got a talent hub and we've got a membership, and it's myself giving them diversity, equity and inclusion advice, so that it's not just tokenistic, it's about thinking long term of how do we create that change and create the longevity.
I think Jane Caro's got a great quote when it comes to gender equity, when it comes to female representation. She says, we'll know there's gender equity in the media when we have as many mediocre women as we do mediocre men.
Yes.
And as an ex-history teacher, I can tell you when you think that history is written by the victors, and what we assume are victors is a very sort of problematic thing anyway. But you read some of the history texts we grew up with, and you read them, and you're just like, now you look at them through our lens and think, whoa, no. But do you know what? In a lot of schools, those texts are still around.
Yeah.
Right, Karlie, you're working across academia and the community services sector. What sort of expectations do you deal with as a new Aboriginal lecturer and community worker, and what do you wish people would stop doing?
Thanks, Dee. Before I begin talking, I just want to acknowledge country quickly. We're here on Gadigal land. I'm a Yuin woman, I'm not from here, so I just want to make sure that I do that to ground myself first and foremost. I'm a little bit nervous. I feel like I've come I didn't even walk in with a piece of paper. I came in and I was like, oh, maybe I should write some notes about this. So, yeah, I suppose I'll say I graduated from UNSW in 2019, so I haven't been in the sector for a really long time compared to some other people who are community workers. Some people do it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So, yeah, I feel quite underqualified to talk about that, but what I can talk about is my experience. And yeah, I started out working in casework, working with young people aged between 12 and 15 years old, primarily Aboriginal kids in the local area around Redfern, Waterloo. I was working at Weave Youth and Community Services, which some of you might know of. I feel very proud of my work there, and I currently am a program manager of our Aboriginal healing program there, which is my baby. I kind of developed that and designed that, and we've got it off the ground. I now have a team of Aboriginal cultural engagement facilitators is their name that we've given them, who I manage and do that kind of cultural work in that program. So I feel very proud of that. And the reason I'm saying all of that is so that I can give you contrast to what my other job is, which is lecturing at the University of Wollongong into the social work degree. I started teaching there casually back at the beginning of COVID and was teaching online into the bachelor stream, and then they kind of headhunted me for this lecturer's role an Aboriginal level B social work lecturer, which is a very specific title that they picked out, very intentional on their end. And yeah, I've been doing that now since the beginning of this year. So it's been an interesting experience, and I suppose the reason why I'm saying all of that is because when we talk about expectations, I've been in this role where the expectation is kind of just to show up and be me and bring that cultural kind of, bring myself to the role and yeah, to kind of design and develop something that we can implement in our communities to bring about some kind of sustainable healing change. And then the opposite spectrum is to go into this kind of really big business, the university, and have many things expected of us, I suppose. So I did write some notes about the expectation because I thought there's so many, I'll just get bogged down. The first thing I wrote is the load. It's like the constant cultural load and the burden of being a black fella in a workspace where there's full of white people. They expect you to know everything, and then they expect you to talk, but only when you're talked to, when you're spoken to. It's an interesting dynamic when we're in discipline meetings and I'm sitting there and I'm like, you're all so white. Everything you've got to say is just so white, and I'll try and say something and then just feel like, no, I can't. I'll get pulled up for that later. You know, and having the other element of, you know, being a black woman first and foremost, that's who I am, and this is how I navigate the world. This is a lens through which I see the world, and so I'm in spaces where it's all white and I'm expected just to be quiet. So that's the expectation that I probably find the most difficult. The other thing that I find the most difficult is being constantly accessible to everyone else. Like, you have to constantly be on emails, constantly be at meetings, like, everyone notices if I'm not there because I'm the one black person, but then somebody else will zoom in and I'll be like, I had to be here face to face when I've got all these, a gazillion other things to do, another job to manage, a family, cultural stuff, you know, caring responsibilities, and I had to be the one who's here, but that person couldn't be bothered to get on a train, so they're zooming in online. And that's, I find that really exhausting. I had a conversation with my supervisor last week because she said, oh, you know, you're a bit silent on your emails, and I'm thinking, I check my emails between 9 and 11 every day. That's my email block. And then if I know I've got something on, I'll keep checking through the day. But if I come to the afternoon, I'll check again and then I'll switch off for the day.
So, Karlie, that you would say that you have a higher bar?
Yeah. And I sat in that meeting and I just said, no, I'm not going to be consistently and constantly accessible to you. I've got things that I need to do. My workload is the same as everyone else.
Yeah, good on you.
And thanks. Yeah, so that's an expectation, you know, that we're going to constantly be accessible. Be black only when it suits, keep our mouth shut otherwise. You know, and with that being having the constant pressure of being the only black person in a room, the one who has to speak for all black people, the one who has to have all the opinions about everything black, to share the same opinion as whatever's going on politically in regards to black people. The Voice, for example, is one of those things. And then on the flip side of that, being constantly told that I'm so special and the faculty would do anything to keep me, and, you know, they know how important I am, so we've got to be really careful, stepping on eggshells. So it's just this constant, really juxtaposing experience, I suppose. And for me, the reason that I'm at the university is because I really care about how our communities are treated, and I care about black fellas, and knowing that I'm training social workers who are going to go out into the world and have these interactions with Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities, that's the reason why I turn up every day. I deal with all the bureaucratic crap because I have to, but my intention first and foremost is bring about healing to my community. So that's why I do what I do. I deal with all of those expectations. But the second part to that question is, you know, what do you wish people would stop doing? And there's this piece of advice that I got as a young person, mostly because I used to speak way too much, and that was from one of my uncles. He said that you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth and you should use them in that ratio. And so when I think about what I wish people would stop doing, I wish people would just stop talking and just start listening. And I suppose we're asked to come into this with a call to action, and that would be my piece of offering to this conference is, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and I encourage you to use them in that ratio. And secondly to that, we also have 2 hands, which means we've got 2 hands for doing And the way that I see that is it's our responsibility to listen, to be in relationship and to be hearing what the things that are going on for other people and to be going, okay, well, what do we need to do about that? And to do that in a really genuine way. And when I think about that on a political kind of, I don't know, that macro kind of lens, I think about, I'll use the voice for an example. We're talking about constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, and personally I actually don't even know how I feel about it at this point in time. I feel like there's many conflicting ideas, but what I will say is blackfellas have had a voice to Parliament for so long. We've had the Bringing Them Home report, we've had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, we've got the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Healing Foundation who have been walking alongside Stolen Generations members to bring about healing for them fellas. We've got the Bug Me report, so many things that have been voices to Parliament that people haven't listened to. So along with, that piece of advice, having, 2 ears and 1 mouth, that's a part of that. No one's going to come and save us. Self-determination isn't something that's given to us. It has to be something that we take. And so the way that we do that is by listening and doing. And so that's my...
It must be incredibly destabilising to be in a workplace where the expectations are not just so different, but almost counter to each other.
Yeah.
Is there any have you got any kind of way you can kind of pull people in and say, hey, what you're asking is very different to what you're expecting? Or is it as a junior just kind of in the too hard basket and you just sort of navigate it as best you can?
No, I just tell them I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, fair enough. Good for you.
I think I'm very blessed with being very stubborn.
Excellent.
I just tell people if what you're asking of me is unreasonable, and if you expect me to go above and beyond, then you can pay me for that.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
Right, Sally, you are not an engineer, but it turns out you've become an expert in the train engineering field. How did that happen, and why do you know so much random stuff about train engineering?
That's a long story. So a couple of years ago, the New South Wales government started developing these new trains, and the locking mechanism on these train doors prevented some significant safety issues for people who are blind or vision impaired. And in order to have those safety issues addressed, I needed to understand them and be able to convey that understanding, but also a solution to what the problem was. And to be able to do that, I had to learn all sorts of weird and wonderful things about trains and doors and locking mechanisms and what was an appropriate option. Something that was reasonable, that worked for us, but also didn't produce some kind of barrier for another group of people so that we could all access trains and public transport equitably. That is exactly how I became an expert in train door locking mechanisms. And it has done some good. We haven't seen those trains, the new intercity fleet is what I'm referring to at the moment, released on our network, and we are seeing our concerns addressed, so that's wonderful. But in my role, I find that I am often expected to be an expert on a lot of things. At the moment, we are dealing with advocacy issues that relate to e-scooters or e-ridables and those devices that you see on our street, because they're posing a significant problem to people who are blind or vision impaired. If you can't see them coming, you can't hear them coming, and you can ride them on the footpaths as you come in some states, it's quite challenging. We also cover things like democracy. So in New South Wales recently, we've had access to the iVote system, and that allows people who are blind or vision impaired to cast a secret, independent and verifiable vote. And that's a really important part of our democratic system. And unfortunately, during COVID, iVote was used in a manner other than which it was probably originally intended to be. And that causes some significant issues with election results. That, combined with a few other things, means that the system has been decommissioned. So when we come to the polls in March, there is no way for me or people who are blind or vision impaired to cast a vote without assistance. That means I have to tell someone who I want to vote for. I have to trust that they're going to vote in accordance with my wishes, and I have to trust that they're going to do it correctly. And as someone who likes to execute their democratic right to vote below the line and number every single box, that's a lot of trust to put in a complete stranger. Not to mention just how voting should be secret and we should all have access to it. And yeah, I hear that there are huge personal issues that impact on people, and some people might think, well, it's just casting a vote, it's not that big a deal. But if I can't even elect a government that reflects my wishes, how can I elect a government that is actually going to act on them? So I think if we can tackle these simple things first, then we can tackle these bigger, more complex things. So that's how I became an expert in all sorts of weird and wonderful things that I never thought I'd have to know a thing about.
Is there anything being done to sort out that issue before March?
There is a complaint that I'm leading with the Australian Human Rights Commission at the moment. It's going through conciliation at present. There won't be a suitable resolution before March, which is disappointing. And we've also seen similar issues with the local government elections in Tasmania over the past couple of weeks. We are committing to ongoing conversations with the hope that something will be established by 2027, which will be the follow-up round of elections. But it is an ongoing discussion that I hope we can release the results of the conciliation within the next couple of weeks.
Excellent, because voting below the line is one of the joys of life. Like, you know, that sort of thing of like, who gets to be last, Niall or Hanson is for me. Right, two. A couple of weeks ago, you were named Australia's most influential Asian Australian at the 40 Under 40 Awards. Last year, you spoke up at the critical importance of culturally diverse communities being represented by culturally diverse people who know them well. Alongside your political work, you've had a long career in the community sector and especially working in the community legal sector during COVID. What do you think needs to happen in how we design, structure and deliver services to diverse communities, and what are the areas that need to improve?
Great. Thanks, Dee. And could I also just start by acknowledging country and paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people here with us today. So I think in terms of decision-making, policy, structures, service provision, I think that concept of nothing for us without us is really fundamental, and you need to be able to include the people that are going to be impacted by these decisions. And as you mentioned, during COVID, we saw firsthand how a lack of lived experience, and there were consultation, and you can consult to death, but if you're not actively involving people directly and in terms of participating in making those decisions, then you get decisions like you had during the pandemic, where pockets of Sydney were being subject to these much harsher lockdown laws. And where I live in southwest Sydney, when you see your local basketball ring have the ring taken down, or basketball court have the ring taken down, and you can't even go outside for your 1 hour of exercise and play basketball, and contrast that to people who in the northern beaches who are out on the beach enjoying the sunshine, I think that has a huge impact on how leaders view your community and how they value your community. And I think that was a prime example of the lack of lived experience, but also the lack of empathy. And I saw at that time, lots of consultations being done with community leaders. And it was, similarly a very much tick the box exercise where you consult with a handful of community leaders. I have a problem now with that word in terms of the fact that not many people actually subscribe to community leaders. And so I like to think of community mobilisers and influencers within community, because oftentimes, from my experience, community leaders are almost like the gatekeepers. And so you can't really expect the information, the directions to be trickled down to people on the ground who are most impacted by these decisions. And I think the direct outcome of that is what we saw during COVID-19. And so I think that's really important to be able to expand the power base, to be able to recognise in terms of the decisions that are made, who's being impacted and how we bring them into the conversation and how we make them part of the decision-making process. And we see that reflected, and as Mariam said, in terms of representation. Representation matters deeply, but also when you have people at the table, you want to make sure that they're the right people and that they're actually representing the voices of community. And so I think that's, I guess, in terms of decision-making in politics, but in the community sector as well, the whole top-down, we need to really shift from that whole top-down, charity-oriented approach where, what do we often say, like the white saviour coming in, and I often experience quite a bit of that where I live in southwest Sydney, where a lot of people are trying to come in and give opportunities to young people, and so you're uplifting, a handful of people, but not everyone gets those opportunities and those experience in terms of mobility, or even, I find in terms of my school and schooling life, they'd come in and they'd give scholarships to a handful of kids, bright kids, cream of the crop kids, but what about everybody else? So I think that approach really needs to shift. And in terms of what happened during COVID, I'm part of Addison Road family, and the ability for community-based, place-based approach in terms of understanding grassroots community and the needs and being able to immediately respond to those needs was so critical at a time when temporary visa holders and international students in particular were completely left out of the system. They had absolutely no safety net or support from the government, and they were left destitute. They were losing their jobs, and they were being stood down, and they had nowhere to turn. And that's where community organisations and charities like Addie Road really just relied on the strong relationships that they had with communities and with community-oriented organisations with specialised services really come together, like Marrickville Legal Centre. So we were there every week handing out hampers to people who couldn't afford to buy groceries, and then we had a pop-up legal service there where people who were being stood down and lost their jobs could get free legal advice on what to do. And a lot of these people don't necessarily access mainstream services as well, so being really attuned to the fact that you need to have specialised services that are embedded within community, and having that really core trusted relationship is so important, as opposed to sort of coming in and saying we've got this great service, we've got funding for it, but not actually relating to and including people within that service. I think it's almost futile. And that's what we really saw in terms of being able to truly address the issues that communities were immediately facing during COVID, was to have those really strong, trusted relationships and strong collaboration with networks within the community that were able to engage immediately with those who are most affected and those who are impacted by the decisions that were made, but also just the nature of COVID and how that completely impacted on people's lives and livelihoods at that point in time. So I think it's what we do and what I see in politics too, and I've had direct experience with MPs saying, we really want to engage and build relationships with communities. Please give me a list of all the upcoming cultural events that are happening so I can rock up and wear your traditional outfits, and that's not real engagement. And I think that's what really erodes trust with community as well, because it's not genuine. And particularly coming from a politician, I think people see right through that as well. So it's so critical to actually build those genuine, trusting relationships with communities, because that's when you're going to get real outcomes and real results, and to be able to bring people into the mix in terms of the decision making. But at the core of it too, I think it's about recognising the power as leaders and as decision makers and as service providers that you have, and creating space, I think, for others to come in and share that power, so that the decisions made are genuine decisions that truly have a positive impact on people's lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm on the border of Burwood and Canterbury Bankstown, and the demonisation of Canterbury Bankstown during COVID was extraordinary. But the government just put in laws that refused to understand how a lot of the Lebanese families there operate culturally, and what they think is a household isn't a house, but a family community where you drop your food off to your mum every day because that's what happened, and they're not using different services. And no one really explained to them safer ways to do it. They just demonised them for feeding their parents. It was just astronomical. It was really terrible. It was interesting that the ACT government, I think, was the only government that put in provisions for overseas students, which was nice. Now, Paul, you've worked with the community sector in government, particularly around systems that have major impacts on people's lives, especially child protection, for many years, and you've been a fierce advocate for change in the fundamental structure of those systems. We know the systems aren't working for families or communities. Can we fix them? Should we try? Should we just start again? What should we do? Big questions there.
So I hope we have a while. No, I will try to be brief. As a Wiradjuri man, I want to acknowledge that we are on Gadigal country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge Uncle's welcome earlier. And I also want to shout out to Karlie and the incredible work that you do in the community. And I think it's important that we recognise that. As an Aboriginal person, that I recognise that. I think to go to the question, the easy part is yes, and we have to. Yes, we can change them, and yes, we have to. But I also want to, I think, note a slight caution, particularly when it comes to what that exactly means for First Nations communities. And I think child protection systems are a really interesting policy space to explore that issue, because our child protection systems, our child and family systems, are all about the future of our communities. Regardless of what community you're a part of, our collective interest in our children fundamentally shapes the future of our communities. I've taken a slightly different approach to my friend Karlie. My anxiety means that I need to come with notes, so please bear with me. And certainly, I think the fact that these systems reflect those broader challenges of diversity that we see, that they entrench inequities on the basis of culture, on the basis of gender, on the basis of class, on the basis of disability, is something that we really need to reflect on, and really emphasises the need for structural change. And I've heard the sort of comments from Cathy and others this morning about the importance of representation, about how we use our democracy to make a difference. And I'm certainly listening and reflecting particularly on that issue of how do we be very strategic about it, and how do we not do lots of things, and certainly that's something that I have personally been reflecting on, and the way that we can be more targeted in our approach. But on that issue of how we use our democracy, I sit here as a First Nations person and think, but what do you do when it's not your democracy? Mm-hmm. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because the issue isn't just about the representation in these systems. The institutions themselves must change. Beyond moving to address the social determinants in child protection systems, we need to address the political determinants of wellbeing that continue to inflict harm and create inequality for First Nations communities. Particularly with child protection systems, but we've heard from Karlie her experiences in her roles as well. Having more First Nations people within these systems is an important part of addressing some of the glaring and persistent challenges, but it's not enough, particularly when those systems themselves are oppressive. And we know research led by my colleague Noreen Young at UTS noted the sorts of issues that Karlie raised, issues of identity strain and cultural load that affects First Nations workers in workplaces that clash with their identity and their values and their commitments to community, and that require additional work based on the fact that they are First Nations people, including that they educate others, that they represent community, and the load and the burden and how that nests in the body, how that affects our health, it affects our relationships, it affects our communities. And I worry that the simple idea of this representation is deployed strategically to resist the structural change that's needed. That we see and continue to see these systems promote greater inclusion of First Nations people and argue that this will be sufficient to drive the change. We are graciously presented with a seat at the table, but only within the dominant settler colonial system. Our decisions are always subject to external review. They are always subject to external approval or veto. And in doing so, it becomes First Nations people who then carry the responsibility for change while being denied the levers necessary to make that change. And worse, the conflict that this creates within community is then presented as an issue internal to our community and not a direct result of the politics of power deployed over us. So meanwhile, settler systems congratulate themselves on their performative inclusivity while continuing to exercise authority over us, perpetrating the same harms that they always have. I think the other, and if I can just touch on one more thing, I think the language we use to talk about these systems is also important. We often use this language of the mainstream system, which only has the effect of othering most of the population. And it is used to obscure the cultural and other political elements of that system in a way that then makes it seem like it should be able to deliver equally for everyone. And I think when it comes to First Nations people, when we start asking this question of, well, what do we need to do to make the mainstream system more effective so that it can deliver equitable outcomes for First Nations communities? And that sounds like a reasonable question. But when we say, what do we do to make settler colonial systems more effective so that they can achieve better outcomes for First Nations people? We suddenly go, well, hold on. Is that the question we should be asking? Or should we actually be thinking about how do we change those systems so that First Nations communities can shape their own futures? And I think this has been the debate that has been central to the relationship between First Nations and settler society since the beginning, certainly since 1938 with the first day of mourning, certainly through the 1970s with the move towards self-determination, and right through to ongoing debates about voice, about partnership and shared decision-making and closing the gap, and that we need to see more of this and it be done genuinely, because at the moment it is still ultimately external decision makers who decide our futures. And so I think, do we need to change these systems so that they better serve diversity, are more responsive to the broader Australian society? Absolutely. But there is a particular way that we need to do that and think about that when it comes to the relationship and the positioning of First Nations communities within that. And I personally believe that settler systems can never deliver optimal outcomes for our communities. What we need are ways for us to work where a greater plurality, I guess, where First Nations communities within the broader Australian community can shape our own futures.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I've always given advice to women, which is don't try and fit into this system because it literally wasn't designed for you. You need to change it, and of course it is exactly the same. It's, a system not designed for you will never, ever do right by you.
Sure. And I'm reminded, to draw on your quote from earlier, there's that famous quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg when she asked, when will we know that we've reached gender equality on the courts? And I think people were expecting her to say, when there's 4 or 5, because, there's 9 people on the Supreme Court in the United States. And she said, when there are 9, when all of the seats, because for the entirety of the Supreme Court, it was until Deborah Day O'Connor, I think it was entirely populated by men and no one had a problem with it. And so I think that's another important kind of element to that, and making sure that we're very clear about what we mean when we talk about representation.
So Cathy, just to come back to you at the end, can your model of community organisation and representation take these conversations further, and where would we start?
Well, I think as Paul said, yes. And I'm just trying to apply, thank you for these conversations. Geez, fascinating. So as a Member of Parliament, and I just want to acknowledge you too for the fantastic work that you did, but as a Member of Parliament with our Aboriginal people in Albury-Wodonga and child protection, huge issue, but we could never find the acupuncture point. And I'd keep going to the Aboriginal leaders and saying, well, come on, I can't do something for you. You've got to work it out. And they would say to me, Cathy, just like exactly what you're saying, Paul, is like, it's your system and you're wanting us to fit into your system and we can't. So it's never going to work. And that sort of like answer was not going to work. Because, well, I don't know. So it's one of those wicked problems, isn't it? But I really think, that it's not that there's not answers. It's just very much what you're saying to us is about listening and hearing and then bringing our intellect to it. So I think that's really important. But I do think then you've got to get agreement about what one thing would do really well. And if it's child protection, I just do think some court cases would be really useful. Like, I mean, I know this sounds outrageous, but I just know in my community there were some incredibly bad things happened. And then I know up in Northern Territory with the Dondale, they got a royal commission. So in itself, that's not enough. We got the royal, and it's what you're saying, all these reports to Parliament, like I had a stack of them on my desk. So saying it's not enough, the voice is not enough. With it, but what made a difference to me, which is why I told you that story, my community held me to account. So I just don't see our community holding our government to account on this stuff. Like just for example, the deaths in custody, God help me, the continuing, we as a community haven't held our government to account on those recommendations. So how do you do that? Again, I think it has to be political. And it has to be a wide coalition of people saying, but doing one thing and doing it well. So I'm not even going to start on child protection, but we could do something on the deaths in custody, because that seems to me so obviously an area where our country we're not holding our politicians to account. So anyhow, I think one has to think about it a bit more, truly. But I do like, again, what you were saying too about locally based, locally responsive, nothing about us without us. If you get it right in that community, like think globally but act locally, you can work up. I don't think you can solve these problems top down, coming down. I think it's got to be locally based, which is where you guys are, which is why today and tomorrow is so important, because I don't think there's anybody else in Australia who actually understands stuff in an intellectual way about society, about class, about gender, about race. Like, you guys know that stuff. And I don't think, it's a bit like the cavalry's not coming over the hill. Like, there's no one else who actually gets it. You're all in the room. So I suppose I would be saying that the answer lies with you guys and being the change locally. But I don't want to burden you with it.
I think what's come out of this session, though, that I think is really important is this idea that conversations are only the starting point. And we know what it's like. Everything's wrong and you can have all these circular conversations about it, but it's identifying, almost sort of getting sharp with those conversations, identifying what you can change and using Karlie's sort of thing of your hands, of sort of actually doing something about it, but always having a solution. And I think it was Cathy who said, because if you don't provide the solution, they will, and it'll be probably terrible. So be pointy about what you want to do. Work hard at doing it, but make sure you've got a really concrete solution when you go to people as well. I think that was a great session.
Can I just finish off? You've got to have the threat, which is the question up here, like, if you don't do it, this is what we're going to do. Like, we're not going to stop. So that's got to be part of the solution.
I'm a big fan of negative advertising, as everyone
Yeah,
knows.
so you've got to, people have actually got to
Not my job to do that.
Yeah, but anyhow, just what you're saying, it's not about it being nice, it's actually about being incredibly respectful and polite, and we're just letting it out for you, that if you actually don't return our letters, and if you don't actually, here's what we're going to do. So that's part of the solution, is the action. And I think we often don't do that. We get too scared to actually, and if any of you are parents, you know, if you haven't got the, what's the word you use? Positive reinforcement. Like, if you don't leave your shoes outside the door, you can't come in, and there's no tea, sort of thing. You've got to have the
Carrot and stick. So let's keep the conversation going over morning tea, which is served downstairs in the foyer. And if you can be back in the room ready to go by 11:40 for our next session with Dr. Angela Jackson. Thank you.
Well, Paul, that was fascinating.